Well, good afternoon to all of you. And I think the last day and a half has certainly been an incredibly interesting experience. And many of the sessions throughout the past day and a half have started to encroach on today's topic that this very esteemed panel will be discussing. Can I thank you all for your interest in this? And I know from the discussions that I've been having with a number of people, many of you have been looking forward to what will be, no doubt, a highly informative and nuanced discussion that we'll have with the panel today. I'd like to introduce, of course, our first panellist, Kok Song, the Chairman of Avanda Investment Management, someone who has a very distinguished track record, both in relation to financial management, but also, of course, the geopolitical ramifications of this area. Former GIC President and CRO and Chief Investment Officer of GIC. He built their in-house public and private market capabilities, and he led, of course, GIC through the 1987 market decline, Asian currency crisis and dot-com burst that took place. Can I also welcome to the panel Wei-Jin Shan, who's joined us, the Chairman and CEO of PAG, a private equity firm and former partner of TPG, based previously in San Francisco and now based in Hong Kong, led a number of landmark transactions, including the acquisitions of Korea First Bank and China's Shenzhen Development Bank. And can I also welcome Lord Peter Mendelsohn, the co-founder and chairman of Global Council, a former European Trade Commissioner from 2004 through to 2008, and a British First Secretary of State, among other roles. He and I have been over lunch having a great discussion about politics, coming from different sides of the political aisle, and also very aware of the ramifications of today's topic. So today's topic is Truce or Dare, having a close look at the relationship between the USA and China, what the ramifications from this trade dispute may be, and I will ask them at the end of this to conclude about whether or not they believe a deal will be able to be done between the United States and China. But by way of introduction, I'd like to invite Kok Song to make some introductory remarks about, from your perspective, your view about what's taking place, whether or not this is something more substantial in terms of it being a rewriting of the global order with respect to multilateral institutions, and also your insights as someone who has a foot in both camps and experience in both camps with China and the United States about what lay behind this trade dispute and what the possible pathway forward would be.
Thank you, Steve. First of all, let me declare that I'm not a geopolitical expert. I think there are other people, Lord Mendelsohn in particular, who can probably, speak from more geopolitical experience. Whatever I know and understand about geopolitical issues, I learned at the feet of the founding father of modern Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. And I think we in Singapore, of course, are deeply affected by what is happening to US-China relations. And several of my former colleagues in government have written about that, including Mr. Kishore Mahbubani, who is here with us today. He has written a couple of books about the challenges for Asia in this new situation. So I speak really from the experience, you might say, of being a global investor. I have the privilege of sort of leading the GIC, the Government Investment Corporation, in the investment of Singapore's foreign reserves. And therefore, macro political economic forces are extremely important for us to understand. And the key issue here is really whether the international economic order that we have seen is entering what we call a paradigm change, a paradigm shift, which will require even long-term investors to recalibrate. But it seems to me that we are having what you might call a political reset of US-China relations. A reset. And this reset is already having very significant economic consequences, even social consequences. And I think this is happening because, well, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said that the development of China is the biggest story in the economic history of the world. The biggest story. So it's bound to upset, the balance. And we have now arrived at that point. So my view is that we are entering a period of radical uncertainty in regard to what would be the outcome. And whether you are a portfolio investor like me, or whether you're a multinational company, you have to consider, what do you do in a period of radical uncertainty? And my view on this is that in the face of radical uncertainty, we just do not know what is going to happen. And I think as in portfolio investment, when you do not know what's going to happen, I think the approach that you have to take is diversification. You have to diversify because it's simply very, very difficult to, you might say, over-concentrate your risk or your operations in any one particular scenario.
Thank you, Kok Song. So diversification, I think, is an interesting point because it applies not only obviously in terms of investment, but also potentially for those that are making decisions around CapEx and ways in which they might look at their supply chains. Wei Jianshan, I'd like to invite you in at this stage. I mean, we've seen, for example, speculation in media that Apple might look at shifting their supply chain. I've even seen it reported perhaps shifting it from China to, for example, India. Private equity looks and is forced to make calls around what it is that portfolio companies and others would make if they saw this as being a protracted paradigm shift, as Kok Song said. Your insights in terms of the considerations around supply chain management, as well as any other broad observations, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. I have a look at this trade war issue for some time. In fact, when I arrived in Singapore 2 nights ago, I received the final proof from Foreign Affairs magazine of an article that I submitted to them, which hopefully will come out very soon, on this very subject. And my original title of the article was Genie Out of the Bottle. And the editor changed the title to Unwinnable Trade War. So we already know that nobody wins from the trade war. And I, as an investor, of course, I follow the numbers very closely. And I look at the damages done to the two economies since 2018, when the trade war first started. So throughout 2018, Chinese exports to the United States rose 7% by about $34 billion. American exports to China dropped 8% by about $10 billion. In the first 8 months of this year, Chinese exports to the United States dropped by under 4%. American exports to China dropped by 24%. American trade deficit with China widened by 12% last year and by 7.7% in the first quarter of this year. On the import side, the deadweight loss borne by the United States, because now consumers will have to pay higher prices, is calculated to be about $80 billion by New York Fed. And if America doesn't buy from China, it buys from Mexico at a higher price, and the extra price paid is considered to be that weight loss. That weight loss to China at this point is calculated to be 0. How is that so? The reason is that China, even though raised tariffs on American imports, but only on American commodities which China can buy from other countries. And China actually lowered tariffs on pharmaceutical products, on aircraft, on high-tech products, on Hollywood movies, and even auto parts. And therefore, the average import prices for China have actually dropped. To give you an example, China buys lobsters. And China imposed a 25% tariff on American lobsters. So American lobster export to China dropped by about 70%. But today, China buys more lobsters at lower prices. And how did that happen? Because China lowered the import tariffs for Canadian lobsters by 3%. So Canadian lobster exports to China actually doubled. So you see, Beijing is much more calculating in fighting this trade war than the United States. And as investors, we are not very well positioned to talk about how to shift the strategy when the trade war happened, because since about more than 10 years ago, I made the decision that we would not invest in China in what we consider to be the bad economy. We would only invest in China in what we consider to be the good economy. The bad economy, in my view, includes the export sector and includes all the manufacturing and industrial sectors. Because China's growth model has been driven so much by investments and exports, which has created so much overcapacity, where in those industries it's very difficult to make a profit. In the good economy, as China shifts its growth model away from investments and exports to private consumption, which has increased in the past 5 years from 35% of GDP to 39%, and that's where the real growth comes from. Export as a percentage of GDP has dropped from 36% of GDP in 2006 to about 18% last year. OECD average is about 29%. So export is not that important for China, and export to the United States is less than 4% of GDP. So we, 10 years ago, made the decision that the growth only comes from sectors and businesses which cater to private consumption. So if you look at our portfolio, this year we probably will have invested $2 billion in China alone. We manage about $32 billion. This year, $2 billion in China, all of which goes into businesses which cater to private consumption. And so far, our track record in this regard in the past 10 years is more than 30%. So trade war hardly affects us directly, but indirectly, of course, it damages the economy, especially business confidence, and it damages the global economy, so indirectly, everybody is affected.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And specifically on the issue of supply chain, have you got observations in relation to that?
Right. That's why I say we're not very well positioned to comment in this particular regard, because we have not invested in manufacturing sector at all. But with regard to supply chain, I think there's a lot of stickiness. In May of this year, American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai did a survey of all American companies manufacturing in China to see what they're going to do in response to the trade war. And you would expect that American companies are much more likely to shift production away from China back to the United States, their home country. The survey results shows that less than 6% of them plan to shift production back to the United States. More than 60% would keep their production in China, and the rest will go to Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam. But I think at this particular point, everybody will have to consider if they do shift their supply chain, their manufacturing to countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, what happens if trade war shifted to those countries? So you have to take that into consideration. And before the dust settles, there's so much uncertainty. I think as investors, it's very hard to make that decision because every move costs money. Any investments cost money. And besides, if you look at the biggest name in both American and China market, Apple. Apple assembles iPhones in China. It sells iPhones at $1,000 at retail price per unit. How much value does China add to iPhones assembled in China? 1.8%. So every $1,000, $18 is added by China. Apple itself takes 54%, and the rest comes from third-party suppliers. Such being the case, the trade war, the tariffs on Apple phones hits Apple much more than on China, which takes only 1.8% of the value chain. So if you look at the economics, if you look at the numbers, you would think that first, shifting supply chain is extremely costly. Second, you probably don't want to do it until the dust settles. And third, even after the dust settles, you may not want to do it. And that's why I think the survey by American Chamber of Commerce makes a lot of sense, that most people would rather stay put.
Thank you. Lord Mendelsohn, you're very well placed to provide a European perspective. One of the comments that's frequently made to me as a former Australian Trade Investment Minister, people say, well, Australia's an ally of the United States, very close to the US, but China's your biggest trading partner, and especially on agriculture and resources, you've got to continue that supply into China, and you've got to pick. I'm interested, as no doubt the audience is, from a European perspective, is there a sense that there's also that same dichotomy, a requirement that people are expecting to choose one side over the other? And can you just enlighten us as to the sort of prevailing mood in Europe about the ramifications and implications of the ongoing trade friction?
Well, I think the story of the next couple of decades at least is that the rest of the world is going to be forced to choose. I mean, that certainly you can see in policies being pursued by the United States at the moment, that if you want free, unfettered access to America's financial system, then you've got to choose America in a whole number of different respects, whether it be China or Iran, and no doubt there will be other issues. Similarly, China. If you want free and unfettered access to China's market, you better side with China. For example, currently over Hong Kong, as Cathay Pacific and Swire are discovering. Now, when two big elephants like these start fighting, the rest of us are in danger of being trampled underfoot. If we're not going to sort of jump clearly aside in one direction or the other. And I think this is a very invidious and unpalatable choice, or series of many choices that are going to be faced by both governments and corporates and investors in the coming years. Welcome to the 21st century. Now, you could say, just to take up the lobster supply illustration, that if the United States is sort of determined to pursue mercantilist policies which produce a sort of progressive deliberalization of trade by the United States, a stepping back by the United States from the international trading system, that simply creates opportunities for others to fill the space, to occupy the vacuum. Lucky Canadian lobster suppliers.
Actually, from the same waters.
From the same waters. Welcome to globalization. But I somehow feel that it's not going to be quite as simple as that. Look, in a very real sense, what we're seeing now is the overlaying by geopolitics of a tremendous run that we've had for the last 30 years in globalization. I mean, we've built during that time a tremendous business efficiency machine.
Right.
I mean, all those decisions that have been taken about supply chains and opening up of markets, free flow of capital and people. My God, what an extraordinary 30 years it's been. And now, having taken for granted that the emergence of China, as it coupled its vast population to limitless supplies of capital and now technology, securing its renewed, restored preeminence in the world, that would sort of be tempered and smoothed over by China's anchoring and bedding down in the global economy through its accession to the WTO, and taking its place in the rules-based international system. And for the first sort of decade plus of this century, it looked very much as if things were actually going to go as smoothly as that China, in a sense, had sealed the deal in its place, restored place in the global economy through its accession to the WTO. The United States, after 9/11, was completely distracted by the war on terror. Europe, in its turn, was pretty much distracted by the Eurozone problems and the issues over its currency. And there was a sort of sense that America had a sort of indefinite strategic patience that it was going to, display towards China as China continued its evolution, and as we all assumed, its evolution into a sort of Western-style market-based economy. Well, that evolution hasn't quite worked out as people expected. And what has come along is China, having assumed that, in a sense, that it had America's measure, that it had sort of forged a reasonable relationship of coexistence and partnership as globalization and increasing integration and interlocking of the US and Chinese economies took place, that this would endure. But then, of course, Mr. Trump came along. And Mr. Trump doesn't share President Bush's and President Obama's strategic patience, if I can use that term. And we are where we are. Now, I think the central question that we've got to face and ask ourselves now is whether the US aim in taking on China and triggering the trade war and the war on Huawei and all the other figments of this clash, whether the US aim is to remove certain unfair trading practices and policies on China's part, as it sees the excessive subsidies, the local content requirements, the equity caps, the use of licensing to reduce competition, all the rest of it. By the way, an analysis, an objection to which Europe shares, along with the United States, or whether instead the strategic aim by the United States is simply to remove these frictions and to create a level playing field so that sort of trade can continue, broadly speaking, as normal, or whether in fact the United States has a very different strategic aim, and that is essentially to attack the whole industrial policy machine of China and to take aim at the fundamentals of China's state-led capitalist system, and in the process really take this attack to any degree sidestepping, of course, the WTO as it embarks on this attack, with or without allies, by the way. In which case, I think the world is headed for considerable and enduring disruption. The threat, in my view, of a growing bifurcation of the global economy, which is, I think, going to come to focus very much on technology, on data and information, where we're seeing the emergence of two quite different systems, US-led and Chinese-led, with all the implications that flow from that, and therefore where that will leave us in the rest of the world. Pretty painfully off. Whatever happens, we are facing in the medium term, I think, a different process of globalization than the one we've seen in the last 30 years. I think we're seeing an erosion of that sort of business efficiency machine that we've taken for granted all this time. I think it will not be removed, but I think it will be weakened, and I think the world will be facing lower living standards and incomes than we would otherwise be enjoying if the current broad stability were to continue.
Stephen, can I just maybe add to Peter's comments? There's no doubt, I mean, the integration of the global economy, that we saw in the last 3 decades has now, you might say, going into a bit of a reversal, and we might be talking about a decoupling, right? Less integration, in fact, going backwards. That's already having consequences for business confidence around the world. We are seeing the global economy slowing down because the animal spirits have been affected by this great uncertainty. That has got implications not just on the trade side, but it's got great implications for the solution of bigger problems, such as climate change, such as the war on terrorism.
Of course.
All right? It will impact those issues. But what concerns me even more is that these tariffs and stuff like that, yeah, of course, they've got negative consequences at the margin. But can you imagine how more damaging things will be if the US went from tariffs to sanctions, which they have already applied in the export of technology to China? But what I'm thinking of is more than that. Financial sanctions. Because we operate in a world where the US dollar is the dominant currency. Even a huge proportion of China's trade is financed in dollars. So I would shudder at the thought of the day when the United States, in a crazy moment, applies financial sanctions on China as they did with Russia or Iran. I think that would be really very, very devastating for global confidence, and I hope that we don't go there.
So I feel at this stage I've got a duty of care to the audience so that people don't leave ashen-faced and feeling ill, to shift some of the focus to perhaps the glass half full model just for a moment. We've heard for the last day and a half about the opportunities that this could also potentially create. Lord Mendelsohn, you spoke about substitution, and certainly from an Australian perspective, we've found that we're a significant beneficiary of the current trade dispute with China. I'd just be interested, Kok Song and Wei Jinshan, if you've got particular views around some of the opportunities that are created, in particular around the ASEAN region off the back of this dispute. For example, commentary about Vietnam having an unprecedented level of interest, opportunities around FDI, and more broadly, whether or not there is, even in the context of some of the pessimism or negativity that you've spoken about, for us to find opportunities in those areas.
I think it's, for the Asian region as a whole, it's a situation where we lose in absolute terms, but we might gain in relative terms.
Sure.
but the bigger damage is going to be the big picture, because the consequences for economic growth arising from this trade war is not that significant for the United States, neither is it for China. But in percentage terms, the delta, the change, is very devastating for the economies of Asia, which are plugged into this supply chain. So I think that is, and that is why if you look at the stock markets, the way the markets have performed, the US stock market has been roaring ahead, perhaps going to new highs. But in relative terms, the emerging markets in Asia have drastically underperformed. So the market is telling you, as to how the, the winners and losers and the orders of magnitude. I think we have, Shan has pointed out, maybe the limitations of how much of a reconfiguration of the supply chain we will see. But we've got to keep in mind, Apple is a good example, but by no means the key example, because the economic value add by China to Apple is not significant, it's negligible. But I think for trade as a whole, the economic value add of China in the last 20 years to the global economy is a huge number, all right? And it would be difficult to say how is that going to shift. Even if a quarter of that were to shift to Vietnam, to Indonesia, will these economies be able to absorb that kind of orders of magnitude? So I think there will be change taking place at the margin, but I don't think we should fool ourselves that there will be a replacement for China.
I think the economic friction between the two countries will be long-term, unfortunately. But at the same time, I'm not so pessimistic about it, because I think both China and the United States are practical and pragmatic eventually when it comes to economics. In the short run, I think Southeast Asian countries will benefit from relocation manufacturing from China to these regions. And of course, everybody is worried about decoupling, as Lord Middleton just mentioned. If people are forced to choose sides between, let's say, a China camp and American camp. But I think it's like in a divorce situation, when the parents are divorcing, and the children probably will try to maintain a good relationship with both, while telling both that they actually like them much better. So my thinking is that the sanction that Ko Song described will not happen, because the cost on the United States will also be enormous. So it's not one way. It is easier to do that towards the Soviet Union, when the economic integration was minimal at the time. Today, for example, Qualcomm is a large technology company. It actually sells more in China than in the United States. So if you impose sanctions on a company like Huawei or ETZ, Qualcomm suffers likewise, and maybe even more. So at the end of the day, I think both countries will have to calculate the economic costs, especially for the United States, whether or not it's worth it to impose such kind of sanctions while inflicting so much pain and damage to yourself. And I think that economic reality eventually will prevail. But before that, it may last for some time. And people will have to see, like in any war, real damage before they decide to change their stance and their position.
I think what we are seeing at the moment is going to continue certainly for the next 4 years if President Trump is re-elected. But let's also be under no illusions here. There is quite a strong emerging American view of China and not simply a Trumpian view of China. And therefore, I think that we are going to see measures that impose investment barriers, particularly in respect of technologies between the United States and China, an attempt to sort of challenge the loyalty of American corporates and have them, change their supply chains and onshore and repatriate production, the breaking of academic and research ties between the US and China. I think all this is going to go on. I mean, CFIUS is now in sort of 24/7 permanent session. There are higher levels even than those we're seeing at the moment that CFIUS can go to, and I think we are going to see that. The only, in a sense, mitigating sort of factor that might kick in is that the United States is never able ultimately to choose which of those two strategic aims that I initially described it's pursuing. I mean, at the moment, you see a rather incoherent and rather inconsistent pursuit of two strategies. One is to, as I say, remove the unfair trade practices, which is, in effect, to increase opportunities for United States to invest in and trade in and put American goods into the US market. It's a strategy that, if pursued, leads towards greater integration between the United States and China. The other sort of alternative strategy that I described is one to sort of boycott or derail China, or to try and introduce some economic or investment iron curtain around China. In other words, to isolate rather than to integrate. Now, I have a huge... We're all going to lose from that, by the way. I mean, the whole world. Everyone will be worse off as a result. But of course, as a Western politician, or former politician, whatever I am, now chairman of an advisory business advising on public policy, my concern is that at the end of the day, the West will be worse off from this, that we really are, cutting our noses off to spite our faces here. And I hope that in due course there will be a sort of a reality adjustment so that, when we wake up to what's happening to the international system, we are hugely damaging trust within it. We are hugely weakening international institutions. We're hugely damaging the rules that underpin the global economy as a result of the actions which are being taken at the moment. If instead of evolving and seeing the world grow into a renewed, strengthened, more representative international system and order, we instead, as a result of our actions, see the current international order being replaced by a completely disorganized system and the chaos that will ensue, we have to recognize in the West that when the law of the jungle takes over, we will suffer significantly from that. It's true that the international order, the system of global rules that has been put in place in the post-war era, did reflect Western priorities. It did reflect Western prerogatives. It did frankly address the demands of Western capital. So much is obvious. Now, what we in the West have got to recognize is that there is a new world with new players, and that we have to allow a huge adjustment of that international system to which we have got to invite China to the table as a major power sitting alongside the United States, Europe, Japan, and the rest. And that if we don't do that, and if our policy doesn't go in that direction, then the disorder and the chaos that is going to set in is going severely to damage and undermine our economies and our living standards as a result.
So
Painful, but I'm afraid we've got to face up to that.
So, I mean, that opens up a terrifically rich seam of discussion, but we have around 10 minutes left. I would like to throw it open to the floor for questions. So if you have a question, we have roving mics. Please put your hand up in the air. We have an informed question at the front.
Thank you, Kok Song. Both you and I did learn a lot from Lee Kuan Yew. So the question in my mind is, what would Lee Kuan Yew be thinking if he were alive in this room, listening to this discussion? And I think one thing that would definitely surprise him is that, I was with him when he delivered a lecture to the joint session of Congress, and his entire lecture was about the virtues of free trade. And he got tremendous applause, and there was complete unanimity of views that free trade was good for the world. So what's surprising now is that even though Donald Trump doesn't believe in free trade, one would have expected that the other institutions in the United States or United States allies in Europe would speak up more strongly and say, hey, hang on a second, as you were saying, Peter, these are Western rules, we created these rules, they work for us, they work for the world. So my question to Peter and Sean is this: why aren't the other voices in America and why aren't the other voices in Europe speaking out more strongly to defend free trade from some of the absurd remarks being made by President Trump?
Good question. I mean, it's partly because we share a lot of the US and President Trump's analysis of what's happening and the unfairness of many of China's trade policies and practices, and we want to see them changed. We want to see them removed. We want to see a fairer and more even and level playing field created internationally. So, I mean, we would go with strategy one of the US, make the international trading system, preserve it, sustain it, and make it fairer for all to participate in it. Europe would not go along, in my view, I don't think it would have the stomach for it, even if it was inclined to pursue it, would not follow strategy two, which is confront China, isolate China, try and put some sort of investment or technological iron curtain around China. I don't believe that Europe will follow that. Why doesn't Europe speak up, though, more? Lack of leadership. I mean, we only have one serious European leader in place at the moment, and that's, no, it's not Boris Johnson. In case anyone was, I mean, the only effective European leader we have at the moment is Macron. In France. He's the only person who seems to have a vision of Europe, a view of the world, and has the words and the wit to speak up. And this is a sad comment, I'm afraid, on the state of European politics and the state of European leadership. We are also, of course, constantly tugged through American pressure, if not entirely to endorse President Trump, nonetheless not publicly to contradict him either. Now, I think that Europe's got to wake up to its strategic interests here, and it's got to find got to identify its interests, it's got to find its voice, and it's got to find a way of, articulating, both of projecting its values as Europeans and protecting its interests, and that requires stronger European unity. Not less of it.
What would Mr. Lee Kuan Yew advise in the current situation? Well, a few years ago, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew asked me to help him to learn meditation. And my teacher and I did an interview with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. And my teacher, who is an English Benedictine monk, asked in that interview, I said, Mr. Lee, would you recommend that when the leaders of the world, the political leaders of the world come together for a summit meeting, they should begin the meeting with a period of meditation? And Mr. Lee says, they would think it is rather odd. We've come to resolve significant problems, and you are asking us just to meditate. So my teacher then said, but would you recommend it? He said, yes, of course. I would recommend it, because from my own personal experience, when we have to consider issues of such magnitude, of such consequences, we would do well, to meditate not just for half an hour, but for a few days before we embark on our course of action. So I'm afraid the problems are
Can your teacher go to Mr. Trump? And do you think that? I mean,
no, you see, Peter, the problem is that Mr. Trump's mind is like a tree full of monkeys. So he will find it very difficult to meditate, but certainly, if he can learn that, I think it will make a significant difference.
I found
tree full of monkeys.
I found Koh-Seng's voice and mannerism are so similar to the former Prime Minister, Mr. Lee. So similar. Reminds me of him. I remember what he said with regard to U.S.-China trade relationship when most favored nation status was renewed every year, debated in the Congress every year. And in 1997, he said, this will be the last year. If America gives China MFN this year, there will be no need in the future because the economics of the two countries will be so integrated. Yeah. Look, I think that to the extent China can open up more to foreign investment and trade, and that will be good for all trading nations, all its trading partners, and for China itself. To the extent China can engage in structural reforms to downsize and privatize its state-owned sector, that's good for all trading nations and for China itself. To the extent China can improve intellectual property regime, protection regime, that's good for China, for the rest of the world. So I think China should be willing to take these initiatives to open up its market. Why Western countries are not on the side of the United States in this trade war? If you look at the list of the 10 biggest trading partners of China, you would find that only 2 countries are suffering a trade deficit with China. One, as we know, is the United States. The other is Vietnam, tiny. And Vietnam overall has a trade surplus. Vietnam is benefiting from this trade war as supply chain moves to Vietnam. For all the other countries like Australia, like Germany, like Japan, like Korea, they all have substantial trade surplus with China. China's current account surplus at this moment is almost zero, less than 1%, whereas 10 years ago it was 10%. So China's trade is moving towards balance, and all these other countries are benefiting from it, and therefore they're not in the same boat as the United States. America, unfortunately, is fighting this war alone.
So this has been a terrifically interesting conversation. I'm mindful we only have a minute or two left, so I don't have time for additional questions. But I would like to invite each of you to make a closing remark, and I would pose the question to you about whether, and some of you have sort of answered this already, but whether you think a trade deal can be done in the lead up to the 2020 election. But in answering that question, can I preface it with this observation, again, exercising my moderator's prerogative. President Trump has said repeatedly that he does believe in free trade, but he believes in fair trade as well. And Australia's lived experience, for example, when the steel and aluminium tariffs were put in place, was that we were exempted from the tariffs because we have a no tariffs, no quota policy for the United States coming into Australia. In that context, given that it doesn't seem to be actually an ideological bent, but rather one about forcing a fair trade outcome, to your point, Peter, about the first scenario, I would be interested in, mindful of that, your comments about whether a trade deal can be done by 2020 in the minute that we have left.
Well, I think the political calculus has changed in the last 1 year for Donald Trump. I think before, a year ago, the expectation was that in order to get re-elected, he's got to get the stock market at a high level. I mean, he's fixated on the stock market. He watches the markets more closely than I do. So his political calculus at that time was, I need to get the stock market at a very high level before I go for re-election. And the way that I would do it is to clinch a deal with China. I think the calculus has changed in the sense that he now realizes that if he were to do a deal with China and compromised, he is going to be sort of out-trumped by his democratic opponents, who just say, you're talking about tough and you're soft on China. So Trump cannot afford, to be accused by the Democrats of being soft on China by doing a deal, right? And now I think he's still hopeful that the stock market can stay high because the Federal Reserve has now concluded that it was a mistake for them to have tightened monetary policy. The Federal Reserve now is going to ease monetary policy, and that will keep the stock market up for Mr. Trump, thereby enabling him to hang tough on China.
So no deal, Lord Mendelsohn?
I think there will be a deal of sorts. I think it will lead to, a deal in which whatever its content, from which President Trump will claim complete victory, as he usually does. I think it will be an uneasy truce, and it will not resolve what is a bigger sort of geopolitical play here, in which trade and investment are going to be the sort of collateral damage. And lastly, I'd like to congratulate you and everyone here, including myself, for getting through an entire hour of discussion without once mentioning Brexit.
That's tomorrow's discussion. Young Chan.
I think eventually it's a matter of economic imperatives. I think that by my calculation, the trade war has cost America about 0.5% GDP every year. When the GDP grows at 3.1% in the first quarter of this year, that's insignificant. 2% in the second quarter. The consensus for the end of the year is 1.5%. That's when it becomes significant. And America is experiencing the longest economic expansion in history. But we all know that that economy eventually is going to go through cycles. The next phase is the down cycle. And I think when the cycle turns, the economic imperatives will come into play. Now you don't feel the pain, but then you will feel the pain. And that's when I think people will think twice about continuing with this trade war, which will have political implications. So I believe that if not sooner, sometime in 2020, the course will change, along with the course of economic performance.
Well, there you have it. 1 no deal, 2 pragmatic deals. And can I please invite you to join with me in thanking our very distinguished panelists.